Great. Thank you for this opportunity. While we have this slide up, I just want to say this is by Thomas C. Skinner, who was a very noted artist. He actually, his sister was married to Homer Ferguson, who was, of course, president of the shipyard during World War I and World War II. He is the guy that actually oversees the building of these aircraft carriers. Homer actually said of Skinner that he was wonderful. He fashioned every one of his paintings with the eye of a draftsman. And so Skinner became the official artist of the Newport News Shipbuilding. And then when the shipyard and Archer Milton Huntington joined together to create our museum, the Mariners Museum. Skinner became the official artist of the Mariners Museum. So we like this guy a lot. And this is, of course, the USS Ranger. Now, Thomas can tell you more about the Ranger, I'm sure. He also, all this information we're sharing today is coming from Thomas's book. Why don't you tell a little bit about your book, Thomas, please?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you so much for this very kind introduction, Julie. Yes, so here in the spirit of a little bit of a, well, self-promotion, right? So here's the book. It just came out last November. And well, what you see here actually on the cover page is not Newport News. It's not Newport News. This is actually Bethlehem Fall River in Quincy, Massachusetts. That's a shipyard that is no longer in operation nowadays, but that will figure in the story that we're going to be telling today. Just to give you kind of a quick rundown what's in the book. It really starts kind of with a fairly broad discussion, really, of the significance of shipbuilding in the larger framework of American industrial history. Then it sort of goes into the crisis period of the 1920s in chapter 1, then kind of the rebirth of the American shipbuilding industry in the 30s, particularly under Roosevelt. There is some stuff because I'm kind of a bean counter techno historian. There's a lot of stuff on marine engineering, on the power plants that went into the carriers and went into the battleships, on electric arc welding and the development of that particular technique. Then chapter 3 really deals primarily with sort of, the strategic challenges facing the United States, and primarily in the Pacific. The Atlantic came later, really, at great cost, actually, because it was for a while quite neglected, and it came back to bite, particularly the United States, in the opening phases of World War II. Then the book deals with Navy yards, and there's actually a fantastic picture, if we get to it, would be great, of the Norfolk Navy Yard during the Second World War when they built Alabama, the battleship. And, this has important case studies of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. These were all, and that's key, really, Navy-owned and operated facilities that were really the ace in the hole of the American shipbuilding industry. These were government-owned and operated businesses, most of which, well, none of which nowadays build ships anymore. But and that's thanks in part to corporate lobbying that took out that government competition, primarily in the 1960s. But coming back to this, the last chapter really deals with the private shipbuilding industry. That's where Newport News figures very prominently as an organization, and as a business, really. So, that kind of just gives you a general sense of what this book is all about. Now, when you are thinking about shipbuilding during the Second World War, what usually happens is, people think about things like, Liberty ships, right? These mass-produced, Henry Kaiser made, and you had the subsidiary of Newport News in North Carolina as well. But Homer Ferguson, actually, of Newport News Shipbuilding, whom I quote quite a bit in the book, had some interesting things to say about this. During the Second World War, this was in 1943, he gave an address to the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers. I think this was in New York City. And so he gave a talk about kind of the situation that was confronting shipyards that were not Henry Kaiser, that did not mass produce ships. And I love this quote. I stick this in anywhere I can, because it says, "We have heard a great deal of talk and publicity about the new ships, the Liberty ships and other types. But nothing practically has been said about the old shipyards. And these old shipbuilders have built more ships, higher grade ships and finer ships, but on account of the secrecy surrounding our war movements, that is government censorship, no one has been able to say much about it. These people who are unpublicized, who don't get their pictures in the papers, by the way, unlike Henry Kaiser, have forgotten more about shipbuilding than most of the new people have ever learned or ever will learn. And these old shipbuilders are building real fighting ships that require design, knowledge, and experience." Actually, I put that quote as a title of an article that I wrote some years ago. Anyway, so that is the idea: fighting ships that require design, knowledge, and experience. That is really what Newport News, in so many respects, is all about. Speaks to the larger theme of the book, and that is that naval shipbuilding is not a mass production industry. It's not like automobile production. It is not like making boxcars. So in that respect, we're really dealing with a very unique, highly skilled industry, design-intensive industry. Historians call this batch production what they really were engaged in. You didn't build 2,700 aircraft carriers in World War II. You built 27 for the Essex class, right? So that is one of the key themes really in the book. And it's really, in some respects, a neglected theme in American business history. That is the idea that there are firms other than Henry Ford and General Motors, that had very, very different production philosophies, workplace tooling, worker skills, all of that, right? So let me see if I can get it on. Yes, as far as this sort of, that I want to kind of introduce Newport News shipbuilding in the larger context of a very severe crisis that affected American shipbuilding post-World War I. You kind of see this here. It starts as late as 1921. The United States put out a huge amount of tonnage. This is a lot of the leftover wartime programs, and then pretty much the merchant shipbuilding industry starts really to collapse post-World War I. There was massive amounts of overbuilding. Ship prices just dropped left and right, and you could just get a real cheap government-built, government-owned in many instances cargo ship for almost nothing. Instead of ordering a new one. So, that's a real problem really for organizations like Newport News. And that is where actually Bethlehem Fall River comes in, because Bethlehem Fall River was, like Newport News, facing some serious problems economically post-World War I because all the commercial contracts dried up. Now, Bethlehem Fall River was in the fortunate position of getting a conversion contract for Lexington, which was a former battle cruiser that was redesigned as an aircraft carrier. And so you see this here. That is the Lexington under construction as late as 1927. It took a long time to convert a battle cruiser into an aircraft carrier. The sister ship was Saratoga, but that was not built over at Newport News either. It went to New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey. So as far as sort of design expertise and capabilities were concerned, these organizations had a leg up as far as the ability to design and construct aircraft carriers are concerned, right? So Newport News, in the meantime, was having a terrible time. I mean, in terms of business losses, you kind of see that here, right? The bottom is falling out underneath the profitability, really from 22 straight up to 1924, and they barely scraped by later on in the decade either. So in many respects, you're really looking at a crisis-ridden industry, and that made itself felt at Newport News as well.
Yeah, all the Newport News was very tragically upset by the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. And Ferguson has this great story that he underbids on the conversion of the Leviathan from a troop ship to a passenger carrier. And so he loses $1 million. So he has to go up to New York with his resignation in his pocket. And he goes to see Mrs. Huntington, who was married to C.P. Huntington, then at this time is married to Henry Edwards Huntington. So she got around, let's say. And so he goes up and Henry meets him, and actually Ferguson tells him that, well, we lost $1 million. This is just after Huntington had taken $750,000 out of the shipyard coffers to buy Gainsborough's Blue Boy. And so Ferguson says to Huntington, we lost $1 million. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. Huntington, Henry Huntington, is actually the chairman of the board. And so he looks at Ferguson and says, well, my wife owns all that stock in that company, and she's not feeling well today. So let's say no more about it. And so Ferguson gets away with it in an amazing way. And all of Newport News and all of Hampton Roads was really affected by the Washington Navy Yard. I mean, they were building battle cruisers at Newport News, but they had to take them all apart. So you can just see how, as that graph showed us, it was terrible. And so how do we get to aircraft carriers in Hampton Roads is very interesting. I think the first quasi-aircraft carrier is the USS Fanny, on which Jacques Lamontagne launched his balloon in August 6, 1861. So that's kind of an aircraft carrier, I guess. But the first real one, during World War I, the British recognized the need for aircraft carriers. And so when the war is over, the United States is behind Japan and Great Britain. So we actually take the Jupiter, and transform it into an aircraft carrier at Norfolk Naval Shipyard, known as the Langley. And the Langley is our first aircraft carrier, and it is the one that is built over at Norfolk Navy Yard. And it will sink in 1942 because it was slow. It was a real flat top, I guess you could say. So this brings us up to a change in naval warfare that also here in Hampton Roads, Billy Mitchell proves that, yes, you can sink a ship with a plane, and you could do it rather well. And the planes are less expensive than ships. And so he proved a point, but got court-martialed for doing so. And so that brings us to the recognition that, well, we need to have aircraft carriers. We have a 2-ocean Navy. And so that takes us from using these converted vessels into actually building from keel up aircraft carriers. And I know Thomas can tell us all about the USS Ranger.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And that's I mean, this is just fantastic background material, right? I mean, in terms of trying to understand how does Newport News end up in the aircraft carrier business? Well, they needed the money, not to find a point on it, and so it turned out that the Ranger contract was quite significant. Now, the backstory to this, I tell in the book. And as we mentioned earlier, New York Shipbuilding and Bethlehem Fall River, by virtue of the fact that they had built the Lexington and the Saratoga, had, of course, a great deal more experience in aircraft carrier design and construction, right? But raises the question, how did Newport News end up in the aircraft carrier business, right? And, and I mean, they will become eventually the lead yard. They're going to build the Yorktown and Enterprise. They're going to end up building a Hornet during World War II. They were the lead builder of the Essex class, and they ended up building Midway as well. So, you kind of wonder how did they do it? Well, make a long story short, it was a pretty dirty deal that was done in 1927 in the Washington Hotel. That's called the Mayflower, and so we are talking about a smoke-filled back room where people got together, the leading executives of Newport News Shipbuilding, that is Ferguson, of Bethlehem, and of New York Ship. And they basically said, we are going to slice up the Navy business. Newport News made a pretty, it turns out, a very good bet by saying, you know what, we would like to build aircraft carriers. The New York Ship from Camden said, you know what, we would prefer actually light cruisers. That fits a lot better with our plant layout and all of that. And Bethlehem Forever said, okay, how about we take care of the heavy cruisers? By the way, those were the only ships that could be built under the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. So it was, in many respects, a very questionable deal. But what it did do, by the way, this was revealed under the Knight Committee hearings in 1935, became known to the American public, and people were not amused by this because it smelled like a cartel, which it was. At the same time, I will say, and I will admit, I mean, I'm not a big fan of cartels, but the point is this, this slicing up of the business in 1927 made it possible for Newport News and for New York Ship and for Bethlehem Forever to develop very, very specialized design and construction expertise. And that's, I will admit, that served the US Navy and the shipbuilding industry well in the 30s and during World War II. So again, I mean, the book lays out the whole sort of drama of how this happened and, all the negotiations that went down. The Ranger itself, again, you kind of see that here. Here's another photograph that I took out of the National Archives that did not, by the way, make it into the book, but, gives you a sense of how Ranger's under construction at Newport News. And, well, I mean, as John mentioned, this ship was really the first purpose-built aircraft carrier in the US Navy, the first one. And that is not something that got converted from other hulls. So that was, in a sense, a prototype, an experimental ship. It turned out not to be very good at all. It was severely underpowered. Engines produced somewhere in the neighborhood of 56,000 horsepower, which is really nothing or very little. This ship turned out to be way, way too slow for Pacific Ocean warfare during the Second World War, which is why they deployed it against the Germans in the Atlantic. But, again, I mean, it speaks to the fact this is experimental in so many respects, really. It had very poor seakeeping qualities as well. So I think Newport News learned some very important lessons from all of this in the construction of the next generation of aircraft carriers, and that was the Yorktown class. John, anything you wanted to add to this?
Yes, I'll tell you, I wrote a book about Hilton Village, so since we're promoting our books, and Bill Styron, the great author, actually lived in Hilton Village and watched these huge ships being built. And he wrote his first really successful novel was Lie Down in Darkness, which was a kind of story about Newport News, but changes the names to protect the innocent, but everyone knew who he was talking about. But he did witness the launching of 3 of these aircraft carriers. And in Lie Down in Darkness, he said, life was dominated by the biggest shipyard in America and by the outlines of such naval behemoths as Ranger and Yorktown and Enterprise, each of which As a boy, I witnessed slithering majestically down ways loaded with tons of sheep tallow into the muddy James, which parted at a prodigious impact like the Red Sea making way for Moses. It was an incredible, busy, deafening world I grew up in. All technology and energy revving up for the greatest clash of arms in history. You know, I wish I could write like that. I guess you do too, Thomas. But that really captures this idea of how important these yards producing. Well, Newport News Shipyard producing these fast attack carriers, as Thomas referenced. The Ranger was a prototype that didn't work well. The shipyard recognized it right away. And so with the Yorktown class, they're producing these very fast carriers that could compete with the Japanese. The Japanese built their first carrier in 1918. And so, we don't have one in the water until 1922. So you can just see we're behind the 8 ball right away. But the Newport News Shipbuilding is able to perfect these designs that made these ships so successful because they could take a pounding, they could deliver aircraft, and they are the backbone of the American Pacific Fleet. I'm sure Fore River would say, "Oh my gosh, we made the wrong decision." So did wow. Because you think heavy cruisers, wow, yes, we like those. Actually, Newport News built 2 of them in the late 20s. But the trouble is that Newport News, Ferguson, who always seems to have made the right decision, somehow recognized the future was in aircraft carriers. And that's why we still build them in Newport News today. In fact, if you go down to the shipyard, which is about 7 miles from where the museum is, and that's it's amazing. We've got the Enterprise there, and we're building the Stennis is there, and we're building another one. So the shipyard has such a large workforce, all because of the foresight of Homer Ferguson, who, as you know, took over the shipyard from Hopkins, who went down on the Lusitania. You're back in those days, you didn't have fax machines or computers. So when you wanted to sign some major contracts, what did you have to do? You had to go over to England, and we had perfected a type of steel belt that we are going to sell to the British to place in their aircraft or in their battleships and battle cruisers. And so he's going over there to sign contracts, and he didn't make it. The guy with him, Fred Gauntlet, actually swam to safety. And he would tell that story yearly at the Mariners Museum till he died. So anyway, that's my take on these shipyards and how important they are. Thomas knows far more than I do. So about how important is the Yorktown class, Thomas?
Right. Yeah. So, and thank you for this, interjection, because these are important stories, right? People actually back then did have to meet in person, right? They're not sitting in front of some screen. And so, in so many respects, it's a much more personal business, right? Yes. So as far as, well, by the way, one of the things that you did mention was the James River. Well, rivers, of course, are very important. And I will say that Newport News was blessed with the James River. Because you could actually launch very long ships, and the Yorktown was somewhere around 800 plus feet long, right? You could launch those, and remember, back then they didn't build them in dry docks like they do nowadays, but they did build them on land, and then they had to launch these things. Here you have that picture of Ranger that illustrates it, right? You see the building ways in the background, right? So in any event, this was very complicated business. It took about 8 months to prepare for the launching. 8 months, and all that the audience ever saw was, a lady smashing a bottle of champagne across the bow. This was extremely hard work and took an enormous amount of preparation, calculation. You wanted to make sure, especially on narrow rivers, that this hull is not going to slam into the opposite shore. Right. So, and by the way, I mean, the ones that that really perfected this technique was John Brown in Breton, around the same time when they launched the Queen Mary. And the Queen Mary was the one that's now in Long Beach and in California. And, that was the biggest ship ever launched from slipways. And the point is, you had to do these massive calculations to calculate the launch speed. You had to factor in wind speed, all of these things. Actually, the Queen Mary got launched within 2 feet of the calculations, within 2 feet, which is remarkable, really, in so many respects. Newport News learned a lot from that, learned a lot from the British in terms of launching ships on narrow rivers. Yorktown and Enterprise, here is one. By the way, you see a Hammerhead crane here that dated to the World War I period, and this is a very significant piece of equipment for the shipyard. These things were hugely expensive, and especially post World War I. It was really difficult for shipyards and financial trouble to finance these things. Newport News did put some money into them, and this turned out to be a very valuable addition to the physical plant of the place. So they did build 2, as we mentioned. So down at the bottom you have Yorktown. If you can see this in the background, in the dry dock, that's Enterprise. That is outfitting at that time. What they did do, again, because when you launch a ship into a relatively shallow river, you worry about your propeller screws, right? And potential damage. So what they did was they launched the ships without propellers, and then they put them into a dry dock and put the propellers on. So, I mean, this is kind of one of the many ways in which the shipbuilding practices of the 30s really differed quite significantly from what happened later. So that's that. And I mean, another thing that we should mention kind of in this context, I mean, these carriers were faster because they had better engines. They had much more powerful engines. Eventually, the Navy is going to experiment with what's called high temperature, high pressure engines. All of that stuff, it's in the book for the connoisseurs. But the point is, there was a lot of innovation that went into these carriers, into these 2. One of the things that got introduced was actually electric arc welding. Electric arc welding. Prior to that, you riveted ships that started to kind of recede in the 30s, primarily in the naval shipbuilding industry. One of the things that they had to pay attention to was displacement of these ships because of the Washington Naval Treaty that set certain limits. Plus, a lighter ship is easier to drive through the water. And so, these were all considerations that factored into the design and the construction of these ships. Now, electric arc welding produces far lighter seams than riveting. And you could save actually, several hundred tons in weight in a big hull like this in substituting riveting with welding. There were problems associated with that. Lots of people were worried about runaway cracks, which was an issue with welds. Newport News ran into this quite a number of times. And by the way, the Navy kept a tight lid on these things because this actually happened in a typhoon in World War II when the bow of I want to say of St. Louis, I think broke off. I think there's a photograph of that in the book, and and this was in part attributed to poor welding. So this was again a pretty difficult business. Newport News found itself sort of right in the middle of a major technological revolution in the 20s and 30s. And again, I mean, you had to put money into this. You had to put serious money into upgrading the physical plant. If you want to do welding, that's a whole different ballgame. You have to have transformer stations. You have to have, well, torches, all of these things. And you have to retrain the workforce. That's not easy to do either, because you can't put a riveter just into welding and be done with it. What happens actually with riveting, you had to use a thing, it's called a pneumatic riveting gun. And those things, they kind of, they vibrated to drive the rivet into the hole, right? If you would do that for a couple of years, it is very difficult to kind of keep steady hands. And so that was, well, it was oftentimes difficult to retrain welders, to retrain riveters as welders. These are some of the issues that sort of cropped up at Newport News and a lot of other places that built naval ships. So important milestone. Now we should say, and this speaks kind of to the macroeconomic situation that was confronting Newport News at the time, that the Yorktown itself was, the money for the Yorktown came from an unemployment program that was called the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. FDR pushed that. And so the money for the construction of Yorktown came out of an unemployment program. It was intended to put workers back on their feet. And not, by the way, not just at Newport News, a lot of other places as well. Plus you had all the subcontractors that played a very important part in this industry. So we are really talking about sort of the resurrection in the 30s of the shipbuilding industry, by and large, on the back really of the Navy. And you kind of see this here, once Roosevelt comes into play, and he was a ship buff. I mean, in case you didn't know this, I mean, FDR loved ships. He had lots of models in the Oval Office. He personally picked every name of a new ship that was built for the US Navy in the 1930s, every single one, sometimes with political considerations in the back of his mind. If you ever heard of the Battleship New Jersey that is now anchored in Camden, Jersey, that was named New Jersey because his assistant secretary of the Navy was running for governor of New Jersey, and he wanted to make sure that that he had some bacon to bring home, right? So, and in any event, so you see a pretty massive increase really in American naval appropriations, particularly devoted to the shipbuilding industry, right? Yes, so that pretty much gets us close to World War II. There's lots to be said about this period at Newport News. They built the America in the meantime. They were not just doing naval. They were also, in addition to that, building ships for the U.S. Maritime Commission that got started in 1936. And the biggest passenger liner looks a lot like the SS United States that's now anchored in Philly. And but the smaller version of that was the America. There was a lot of competition for that ship actually between Fall River, Newport News, and New York Ship, and it was Newport News that finally got it. But in any event, so there's really an uptick in activity at Newport News in the 1930s.
It's so important to the Newport News community. You referenced how great where the Newport News Shipyard is located, right at the mouth of the James River, 90 feet deep water right there at Newport News Point. And actually, everyone talked about Collis Potter Huntington having this vision of creating a shipyard and creating a city that was at a place that God had made perfect for man's use. And so that was Walter Post, who was the first mayor of Newport News and one of Huntington's creatures, as you would call him, like Richelieu. So they built it in a perfect spot. If you go over to Norfolk Naval Yard, it is so narrow where it is located. And so you couldn't create these ships way up in that part of the Elizabeth River. So it is important that Huntington had this vision. and that we were able to then build these tremendous ships that the America T.C. Skinner did this great painting of it. But when you look at the painting, it looks like the America is steaming fast. It just looks fast. And so, and that's thanks to the location and also the expertise at the shipyard. It's really amazing. And so, the shipyard almost closed down. Workforce went from 13,000 to just over 2,200 between 22 and 24. And Ferguson was doing everything he could to keep the yard, his workforces, the skilled labor. That's the big key for Ferguson, is keeping that group together. And so he would build traffic lights. They built wind tunnels for NACA, now NASA. They built turbines for dams in Russia. Yeah, they did everything. In fact, Ferguson complained that, how can you fall in love? If you build ships and love ships, how can you fall in love with a boxcar? But he had to build them to keep his workforce together. So when, they got that first cruiser contract in 27, that was the real rebirth of the yard. So it came close, but thanks to the deep pockets of the Huntingtons, thanks to the leadership of Ferguson, that enables the shipyard to get into those carriers. So anyway, I just want to throw that out.
Very good point. And this is really of critical importance. By the way, the reason I pulled up this particular picture is because that's the USS Alabama that is over in that's a South Dakota class battleship that was built at the Norfolk Navy Yard. And one of the reasons why I like this photograph is because it tells you how tight that place was. Right?
You can see in the background the Elizabeth River. I mean, it is.
Yes.
It is, when you go up there in boats, I filmed off the shipyard, and I don't know, you got to be kind of really good with the tugs to move in and out of there, without a doubt. So that's why they moved all the aircraft carriers up to Sewell's Point. So that was created, Sewell's Point was created in 1916 because the ships were getting too big to make it into the Navy Yard. And so, the Navy Yard repurposed itself in the types of ships that it would build. So, but this is a beautiful picture. Yeah, so I think it's really amazing. And, we could talk for hours on end, couldn't we, Thomas, about this stuff? So, but we've already been talking away for over 45 minutes, and I think we were supposed to talk for 30, but that's okay. I never keep to 30 minutes on my Civil War programs. So how would you like to conclude this, Thomas?
You know what? I mean, I do want to mention Essex. That was sort of Newport News' main business during the Second World War. And that is the Essex class, 24 of which were actually completed during the war. Newport News was the shipyard because at this point they had really carved out a niche in this business in terms of design and construction capability. So they were the lead shipyard for the Essex class. The Essex class was also built in other places in New York, that is in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I think Philly built one, and so did Forever. But in any event, that really is the point where this industry is really beginning to profit very significantly. And of course, the Navy itself profited very significantly from Newport News' ability to build these ships, really.
It's a perfect place made by God for man's use, Newport News, and that's what makes that shipyard so great. And the vision of Ferguson is amazing. To get into this job, we're the only, Newport News Shipbuilding is the only yard that builds aircraft carriers today. Fore River is closed. I think that Bethlehem's closed, New York Ship is closed. And so Ferguson made the right decision in that backroom deal. There's no doubt about that. So, I just think that Newport News Shipbuilding was actually an afterthought for Collis Potter Huntington. He expected to sell it, but he knew, see, Huntington wanted to control everything. He owned the town, he owned the water, he owned the railroad, he owned the just everything. And then, so everywhere he went, he tried to have multiple uses. In other words, in Huntington, he had a factory building boxcars. Because he's dealing with ships, the yard was created for ship repair because all these ships are coming to Newport News because of the coal that is being shipped out. And of course, Huntington owned the coal mines. Huntington owned everything. It's they don't let people do the business like that anymore, I don't think. But Newport News Shipbuilding is the one thing that really we recognize as his greatest vision, even though it was an afterthought. And you can still see the coal trains coming into Newport News and the coal ships coming both to Newport News and into Norfolk. So it's a big business, but not like shipbuilding is for this community. So I think
by the way,
Julie's,
I do want to say
yes.
this is the Midway that was also built at Newport News Shipbuilding that nowadays is up in San Diego. But this is just kind of to end this quick presentation. Well, not so quick as it turns out.
Well, Thomas, why don't you advance the rest of the slides? We
No,
have.
no, we can leave it there. That's
Are you
fine.
sure?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, because there's much more to share. I know we'll have to have you back.
Professors always talk way too much.
No, it's fine. It's fine. We've enjoyed it very much.
I have that problem.
And we had an interesting comment that I'm getting up to it. Henry Kaiser was, of course, a civil engineer. His staff actually asked, when do we pour the keel? You mentioned Kaiser earlier, and we had several folks that shared stories of their folks that had worked at both of the shipyards. So it's certainly a important part of our life here in Hampton Roads.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the point is, especially Kaiser opened up huge opportunities really for women and for minorities as well, as far as their ability, most of these guys, at Newport News and Bethlehem and other places, right? I mean, these were guys, right? These were men that trained. I mean, Ferguson used to say it take 20 years to make a shipbuilder. Right. Yeah. But, so that was very different in Kaiser. Kaiser trained women oftentimes just for a week or two and then put them on the production line. So, the point of this is that that certainly Kaiser created enormous opportunities really for unskilled labor, or let's call it semi-skilled. I don't like the word unskilled.
Right. They did have a skill. Absolutely.
Yes.
And we definitely have folks that want you to come back and finish talking and showing the rest of the slides. So we'd love to talk with you about that before you get too far away from us. And Thomas, if you would show that last slide, just so we can show people how they can get your book and John's books, is through Amazon Smile.
God, I have way too many pictures in here.
I know. Well, and we won't see them.
There it is.
Yeah, so we'll have to have you back. But yes, this one just shows you how you can get a hold of us through our blogs. Next Saturday, this talk will be on YouTube. So please share it with those folks that didn't get to spend more than an hour with us today on their lunch hour. And the Amazon Smile, but John's books and Thomas's new book are available through there. And then choose us as your charity of choice. We get a little money from that. We do reopen, as Sherry has shared with you in the chat box, reopen to the public on May 28th. We're very excited about that, but we will continue our virtual programs. Next Friday, John will be back to his Civil War hat, talking about Ben Butler and the contrabands, which took place right out my back window here at Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. And so that'll be a fabulous program. And so fear not, we will continue virtual. I'll talk with Thomas about coming back to share the rest of the story before he gets too inundated with the fall semester at his university.
And by the way, I do want to encourage people, I mean, if they have follow-up questions, if they have interest, in more particular things, if they have criticism, I mean, I'd be more than happy to take that. And please look me up. You see here in the background, my college is called Baruch College. I'm in the history department, and you can find me there. Please send me an email. Follow up to this presentation. If you're interested in any other things, I'd be really more than happy to chat with you or to email and go back and forth. It's just nice. I mean, to be able to share some of one's work, more widely, and I really do appreciate this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, John. Thank you, Julie.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Thomas. I mean,
Our
you
pleasure.
made a great difference, and the stories you told really help us who live on the peninsula and interface with the shipbuilding. It gives us a better approach to why we're still building aircraft carriers
That's right.
today. And so that really made the difference to the shipyard, and it has never stopped really working. So that is very fortunate for this community. And one of the legacies of the shipbuilding here is Hilton Village. So, you can actually go down to Hilton Village, which is on the National Register of Historic Places. I wrote a book about it, Hilton Village. So anyway, yeah, I'm trying to.
We do have some questions that have come.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, then let's answer them.
So thank you all for hanging in there with us. We'll answer these. Stephen asked, how many carriers were built at Newport News during the years leading up to and through World War II? Let's say 39 to 45.
39 to 45. I want to say 6. That is the ones that were actually finished, completed.
Yeah.
One of the things that is kind of, well, I don't want to go back to the Essex, but the point that is to the Midway. But one of the things is, that ship was conceived in 1942. And this was very controversial. It was a gigantic aircraft carrier. It was 45,000 tons, which is about twice the size of the Yorktown. But, there were real questions as to whether that ship is going to get finished in time for the end of the war. And of course, FDR said, let's not do this. Let's not build these gigantic things. Let's just build more Essexes. And, but there was a huge fight within the Navy, and FDR just said, go ahead, do it. Right. And lo and behold, they finished the entire Midway class after World War II. Ironically, one of those ships was called the Franklin Delano Roosevelt by Harry Truman, who was probably not even aware of this little controversy that, I didn't like Midways. Right. But yes, so that is kind of, as far as the number of ships that were built.
So what if we look at from the 20s to the present, how many carriers?
I can't tell you.
Oh, my gosh.
That's a lot.
There are 3 in the 30s.
3 in the 30s. Well,
6 during World War II. I personally think they have built, since I've been a museum director for over 40 years, right? And here at Newport News, I used to be director of the Virginia War Museum, then, of course, director of the USS Monitor Center here at the Mariners Museum. So that's my connection with the shipyard. And I would say they have built, in those 40 years, at least 10 aircraft carriers.
I think more than that. But I mean, again, it speaks to the fact that this is a batch production business.
Yes.
Right? I mean, you don't build aircraft carriers like you build, for instance, destroyers. The destroyers were built in quite greater numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. So what they've done is by building the first nuclear aircraft carrier, they maintained a great business because they had to refuel every aircraft carrier. So, that is employment for long into the future as we maintain these aircraft carriers and build more. We have to realize the people that are really building aircraft carriers today are the Chinese. And in fact, their Navy, Chinese Navy, is larger than the US Navy, which most people don't realize. But Yeah, it's I don't know if their ships are good as ours. I think they're not, but who knows? I hope
Who
we never
knows?
find out, right, Thomas?
Right.
That's right. That's right.
Well,
Uh,
we do have
More
the
questions?
president of Newport News Ship is on our board, so I'm going to reach out to Ms. Boykin and ask her that total number of carriers, and we'll share that with you next time, Thomas, when you come back to talk. How about that?
Absolutely.
Doug would like to know how many of these carriers were coal fueled.
Coal fueled? None.
None.
None. No. Coal fuel
Okay.
went out the window in the 20s, and better for it. I mean, it was just filthy and dirty, and I mean, we're really talking about oil-fired ships. By the
Yeah,
way,
I mean, I
the
think
book
they
has
went to
quite a-
oil. The British Navy went to oil in like 1908, and with the I think I can't remember which class of battleship, but
Mhm.
it was
You know,
just
class.
you didn't need to have coal reloading, which was a messy thing. You know, that's why you had coaling stations everywhere. Their battles fought over coaling stations, like the Falkland Islands. So both in World War I and then in the Great Falkland Island War. So, which the British had an aircraft carrier which sank a heavy cruiser that during that conflict. So it's amazing how important aircraft carriers are today. So what other questions do we have, Julie?
Dr. Ferrero has one for us. Today, 80% of all U.S. shipbuilding is U.S. Navy. As a business professor, does it make sense to continue shipbuilding competition in what is essentially a monopoly or monopsony? I'm not familiar with that word, doctor. If it's monopsony, I'm not familiar. But anyway, is it important to continue? Why not just apportion ships like in pre-World War II?
Well, they kind of do that now.
Thomas, you're muted. Are you
Yeah, got
muted?
it. Yeah, but they're doing that basically.
Yes.
I mean, where else are you going to go for carriers? I mean, right? Um, yeah, and I mean, I will say that there are alternative models. You see this in Britain, where they built the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers, and that involved, I want to say, at least 8 shipyards that built components. And this is a new technique that came about during the war, modular construction. The Germans tried this out, by the way. The book has some stuff about that, and it turned out, I mean, the Germans were using modular techniques to build submarines during the war with, by the way, terrible results, awful. The whole industry collapsed. It was a gigantic waste of money, which is a good thing because then they lost the war. But the point is this, that as far as sort of a business model is concerned, I mean, you can spread the wealth around if you want. And turn the shipbuilding industry into even more of an assembly industry, not an assembly line, but an assembly industry than it already is. When you're thinking about, the engines that were built in the 30s and in World War II, those were manufactured not by Newport News. Those were done by General Electric and Westinghouse. Right. So, I mean, that's kind of an alternative business model if you want to do it that way.
Well, they do it now at the shipyard because we build submarines with I can't remember the shipyard's name right off my
It's
head,
electric
but
boat in Groton, right?
yeah, Groton. And so it's a big thing that going to this modular construction, we're building submarine pens at Newport News Shipbuilding today because of the great demand for fast attack nuclear subs. And so that's what we build here. And anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in. I think it's very, very important that the shipyard is linked with Ingalls Shipyard down in Pascagoula, Mississippi, where you really build destroyers.
Right.
And so I've been to that yard. It's really amazing when you're traveling from Mobile to Pensacola. And there you see the Ingalls Shipyard. It's a huge concern.
Yes, it's like Newport News here for us,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Well, and Skip has a great comment to close on until we have you both back to finish this lecture. He says, great overview. Love the shot of the Langley coming out of the launchways, which was very dynamic. And we appreciate everyone's participation today. Please share the program with folks you that didn't get to be with us today. And I will work with Thomas and John to come back, and we'll have part 2 as soon as we can get that in the schedule.
Yes,
So
and
thank you all for participating.
next week, we're having Ben Butler and the
Ben Butler,
Contrabands,
yeah,
which is the first steps to freedom, transforming the Civil War from a war between states to a war about freedom. And
right.
it all happened here in Hampton Roads.
That's right.
That used to be I used to do programs for PBS, so
That
that
was
was my
his closing
closer.
line. That's right.
Yeah.
So thank you all for being with us here today in Hampton Roads. And we look forward to your being back with us, whether in person or virtually, very soon. And thanks again, Thomas, for being our guest today, and John.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great working
Have a
with you,
great
Thomas.
weekend. Thank you.
Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.